Welcome tonight, everyone, to this week's Citizens Climate University, a weekly webinar program of CCLs that provides Citizens Climate Lobby supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics relating to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and tonight we're joined by CCL Strategy Director Tony Sirna for a chance to lead a discussion helping all of us understand clean electricity standards, especially as Congress and climate advocates look at how to move forward on climate this year. You've probably already seen stories popping up that discuss this concept, a clean electricity standard. So what exactly is it? How does it work? And how does it compare to a carbon fee and dividend? That's what we'll be looking at tonight. Tony is CCL Strategy Director and strives to drive organization-wide strategic thinking. He supports our long-range planning, helping to clarify organizational priorities and maximize our effectiveness at achieving them. Tony also helps coordinate immediate efforts to achieve strategic goals, promoting synergies across departments and accountability for all of CCL's strategic areas. So with that, we are so lucky to have him join us tonight. Thank you all for making time on a beautiful Thursday to jump in. And with that, I'll pass it to Tony.
Great, thank you, Brett. So we're going to be covering a few different things in the webinar tonight. We're going to be first just looking at what is a clean electricity standard and why should you care about it, get into some of the details of how it works, and then talk about how it compares to a carbon fee and dividend and some various talking points around that, those distinctions. In more detail, we're going to dive in, look at the details of how it works. We're going to talk about alternative compliance payments, which are an interesting potential component of a clean electricity standard. And we're going to look at how we might respond to specific concerns that proponents of a CES might express. And then we'll have some other talking points, and then there'll be time for Q&A discussion. And so if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Hold your questions till the end, and we'll deal with them then. So this first question, first some background. When people talk about climate policy, there's often sort of three buckets that they go into. And the first one is sort of investments and spending. And we're seeing that getting a lot of discussion right now as the Biden administration is putting forth its American jobs plan. And you're seeing, so that's an example of where that investment and spending might, what that might look like. And that could be tax credits for installing solar panels or direct funding of research and development. And then there's the bucket that's sort of standards and regulations. And we're familiar with how the EPA regulates emissions for toxic emissions, et cetera. You can also have regulations that require a certain level of energy efficiency in your appliances, or fuel economy standards for vehicles. These sort of fit into those regulations. And then we're all familiar with carbon pricing, which would impose a fee on emissions, and it would create an incentive to innovate for cleaner options. And then, of course, you can have policies that are somehow a mix of these different things. Like there's ways where carbon pricing is a form of regulation. You can take the money from carbon pricing and you can invest it. You can have standards that have a price that backs them up, or a fine. So there are interdependencies between these different types of climate policies. So when we talk about a clean electricity standard, as I mentioned, Biden's administration is putting forth its American Jobs Plan, and that one of the components of that is a clean electricity standard, or an energy efficiency and clean electricity standard. And these are similar to what we've seen in a lot of states around the country that, they might have been called renewable portfolio standards or renewable electricity standards. They've been around in various forms for a few decades, and there's, and they vary a lot across different states. Some of them require only a small percentage of clean electricity. Some require a very high percentage. Some of them are very specific in terms of what type of things count as renewables, and others are more broad. So the details really do matter a lot. So let's go into some of those details. But first I want to just say, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as clean energy standards, sometimes clean electricity standards. What's the difference between energy and electricity? Sometimes people use energy interchangeably with electricity, but other times they use energy to refer to all forms of energy used in our economy. So for buildings, transportation, so that could include natural gas and gasoline. Whereas when you say electricity, you're being pretty clear it's just electricity. So I generally prefer to stick to a clean electricity standard, since that's really what these policies are generally focused on. So what's considered clean electricity, or clean, and that depends on the policy. Sometimes it's limited to specifically renewables like solar and wind or geothermal or certain types of hydroelectric power. Sometimes it includes big hydro. Sometimes it only includes, smaller hydro. And then sometimes clean electricity includes nuclear. Sometimes it includes biomass plants. It can also include fossil fuel-based power with carbon capture. So these are all in the Biden plan that's been put out. All of these are included. It includes fossil fuel with carbon capture. They're still pretty vague on that. It hasn't gotten down to the level of legislation, so we don't know the details of that. There's also the question, some clean electricity standards actually focus on the amount of emissions. And so they might give partial credit for cleaner, but not fully clean energy. So that if you had something like that, that would actually incentivize natural gas over coal. And in some cases, clean energy electricity standards have actually made specific requirements for a certain types of systems. So it might require rooftop solar of a certain percentage, or it might require a certain percentage of wind or a certain. But at its core, it's really covering electricity. And so one of the things to note is that electricity is currently only 27% of our country's emissions. It's one of the larger sectors. It's a big deal, but it is not the entire economy in the way that like a carbon fee would affect all fossil fuels, which is a much bigger portion of our emissions. Now, to be fair, in the future, we're hoping that buildings and transportation and even industry to some extent are going to be electrified, so that long term, sometimes people will say that electricity is someday might cover 80% of emissions, but right now it's only at 27% of the US emissions. Another question about what a CES might cover is, does it cover even all of the electricity sector? Many examples of renewable portfolio standards and clean electricity standards only cover investor-owned utilities. They might exempt smaller municipal or rural electric co-ops. Sometimes, it's based on size and the requirements are just waived for small scale providers. So that's another way that, it's not even always clear that a clean electricity standard would cover the entire electricity sector. The way that a clean electricity standard generally works is it's going to apply an annual target for each utility for clean energy. So, starting now, the US has about 30 to 40% of its energy being produced from clean energy sources. If we want to get to 100% in 2035, which is what Biden's plan is proposing, there would be stair steps along the way to go from that current rate up to the 100% that we want to get to then. People often set a target of about 80% in 2030. Now, this might actually vary from region to region. It might vary from utility to utility. So if a utility is already producing 50 or 60% of its, or selling 50 or 60% clean power, they might start at that 60% and increase on a linear path towards that 100. Whereas if there's some other utility that's only producing 5 or 10% right now, they might be on a linear path and so have lower targets for each interim year. There's, that again gets into the policy details. They all work differently across the country. It's unclear exactly what it would look like in, legislation if this were to come to Congress soon. Another fact in the policy details is that a lot of clean electricity standards include some sort of trading system. This can be very similar to a cap and trade system. So what it might mean is that if there's one utility that produces, that doesn't meet its targets for that year, and there's another utility that exceeds its targets and has extra sort of renewable zero energy credits, they might be called, it can sell those zero energy credits to the producer, to the utility that wasn't making its target. And so that allows, it sort of balances things throughout the whole system. It means that every utility doesn't have to hit the mark exactly, but it also puts a value on those clean energy credits, such that would incentivize some utilities and producers to produce beyond their the target that they have for that year. but it also creates some uncertainty. Having a pricing system, a trading system, means that you don't really know exactly what the value is of those zero energy credits. The price might fluctuate on a market. It also allows some producers to drag their feet, and that could mean more emissions in certain areas. So by allowing that trading, you allow some efficiency in the system, but you also allow some complexity. And like any cap and trade system, there are, those complexities can lead to problems in terms of if you don't set the initial targets correctly, if you allow credits to be banked for a long time, that can, change the dynamics. If you allow offsets in any ways, which, really can undermine a system. And then, so I also want to get to the alternative compliance payment. So the way that might work is, let's say you're that utility that didn't quite meet its targets and you want to buy some zero energy credits. In some systems, there's an alternative compliance payment, and that means you can basically buy one of those credits from the government. And that basically sets a cap on the cost or the value of a zero energy credit. So, if they're trading on the market and the price goes up high enough, then why would you buy one for $100 when you can buy one from the government for $80? What this does is it effectively puts a price on those zero energy credits, and that effectively puts somewhat of a price on carbon. So there's some ways that this starts to look more similar to a carbon price, but the details can be pretty tricky because it's based on the amount of energy produced rather than the amount of emissions. Then you get into some tricky systems where it effectively makes the carbon price different if someone's producing coal versus producing gas. And so it might mean that people continue using coal longer than they would if you just had a straight emissions-based price. We can get more into the details of that if people have questions, but the upshot of it is that there's this sort of backstop that says, you've got this alternative compliance payment. It could mean that people actually continue emitting. If that payment is too low, they might choose that it's just cheaper to pay that fee rather than continue to emit. That could be good or bad depending on your perspective. So let's go delve deeper into that alternative compliance payment. So we'll go to the next two slides. Let's jump one forward. So an alternative compliance payment only applies to the portion of energy that's below that year's clean energy target. So, so if you have a target and you're trying to meet 80% clean energy for the year, and as a utility, you might only produce 75%, then you would need to buy those 5%. You would need to buy zero emissions credits for those. And that's where the alternative compliance payment would be covered. Conversely, a carbon fee places a fee on emissions from all the non-clean energies. So in that same scenario, instead of just paying on that 5%, you'd be paying on the full 25% of the dirty energy that was still emitting carbon. Because of this, a carbon fee always creates an incentive to transition all of your energy to clean energy. It sets a very clear price per ton of emissions, which are fair across all fuels and technologies. So it encourages you to, invest in more efficient turbines. It encourages you to switch fuels to something that's more efficient, et cetera. Whereas the clean electricity standard might only incentivize like that just the incremental amount and just to switch all the way from dirty to clean. And there's no incentive to be more efficient, to burn your gas or burn your coal more efficiently. There's no incentive there might not be that incentive to switch from coal to gas. Unless, of course, if there is a differentiator based on the emissions, it might include that. Again, it gets into there's some pretty arcane details that you can get into here. So let's talk about why are people promoting a CES, and what are they saying about how it compares to a carbon tax, and how might we respond to those kinds of things? So one concern that you might hear is that a clean electricity standard is more politically viable. And in some ways, this could be true. It's sort of hard to evaluate, but I would say, I would respond that all significant climate policy is going to be challenging to pass. Even as currently proposed, the climate and infrastructure package is not going to be an easy lift to get it through Congress. But if a clean electricity standard is easier to pass, it's because it only affects 27% of emissions. It's not as fast at driving emissions reductions as a carbon price, and it obscures the true cost to retail consumers. So, this is one of those cases where a policy might be more politically viable, but it's doing so at the cost of being as effective and being as transparent to the end user, and that there's the danger that passing a weak policy that only affects certain areas, sectors of the economy, might make it harder to go farther later with something that would affect the entire emission spectrum. Another concern you might hear is that people will say carbon pricing is too slow to be effective. But we know that the Energy Innovation Act will reduce emissions very quickly. And so I did some calculations, and because the Energy Innovation Act will reduce emissions 30% in 5 years, whereas if you start from our current emissions trajectory and you look at how much that might increase the clean energy, it might only reduce our economy-wide emissions by 3 or 4% in those same 5 years. So we could be seeing 8 times as much emissions reductions from a carbon price in those first 5 years than we would with a clean electricity standard. And so a good carbon fee can be fast and effective. And as soon as the carbon fee with a clear schedule is announced, businesses will immediately start planning to minimize their use of fossil energy in order to preserve their profits. And so one of the things that's one of the main differences is that a carbon fee will immediately drive coal out of the electricity market, whereas a clean electricity standard may not do that for more than 5 or even 10 years. Another concern you might hear is that a carbon price won't get you to zero electricity emissions. When we look at the modeling, it looks like the Energy Innovation Act will reduce emissions 8 times as fast in the first 5 years and will reach 76% clean electricity by 2030. A CES may also not get you to 100% clean energy if it allows for an alternative compliance payment. So even with the 100% by 2035 proposal, people are talking about 80% by 2030 for the electricity sector. Energy Innovation Act will get you almost to that exact same level. Based on the models, it could easily hit that 80% target. Getting that last 20% out of the electricity sector is harder. The price trajectory of the Energy Innovation Act probably won't clear that up on its own without some significant innovation happening in the next 10 years. But there's arguments that we should be putting our efforts into other areas that are more affordable to reduce the emissions. And it also, it begs the question, if the Energy Innovation Act's price won't get you to 0% to 100% clean by 2035, what does the alternative compliance payment have to be to reach that same goal? Or will you be in the same boat where if the price is not high enough to motivate carbon capture or to motivate 100% clean energy, then that's not going to happen with an alternative compliance payment either. Okay, and then another concern, people ask, does a carbon fee address environmental justice concerns? And I would say, both a carbon price and a clean electricity standard would significantly lower pollution levels from power plants, but only a carbon price will reduce pollution from every source that burns fossil fuels, from the largest to the smallest. So a carbon fee and dividend will affect all forms of industry, whether that's cement or steel or just any place where they're burning fossil fuels to produce heat or in their industrial processes, whereas the clean electricity standard would only lower pollution from power plants. So where I live, refineries are a big source of emissions. That wouldn't really change under a clean electricity standard. They would continue to emit the same level of harmful emissions, whereas with a carbon price, they would be driven to lower their emissions. Okay, and another concern, people will say, would a clean electricity standard allow for more regional equity? So it's true that a national carbon price would have more impact on states that are more heavily invested in fossil fuels compared to those that have already decarbonized. So think about the Midwest where they're still burning a lot of coal to produce their electricity. But if such regional equity issues are of high concern, then Congress could address them with additional funding to consumers or utilities in those regions needing extra support to make the clean energy transition. So, rather than giving those regions a slower trajectory to decarbonize, I would suggest, let's figure out, okay, how do we invest in those regions to help them decarbonize as fast as they can, rather than giving them a pass and slowing down that trajectory of decarbonization. So what are some other talking points I want to go through? And we can just go to the next slide. So people sometimes ask, can you have both a clean electricity standard and carbon fee and dividend? And the answer is yes, totally. They would be somewhat redundant in that both are likely to affect the same emissions, since the carbon fee and dividend would have the most impact or the quickest impact in the electricity sector. So if you had a carbon fee that was high enough, then that's likely to be the primary driver of the transition to clean energy, such that utilities would then be easily in compliance with the clean electricity standard. So this might happen on a state-by-state level. Lots of states have clean electricity standards. If we get a carbon price passed at the federal level, then those utilities are going to be driven by that price to reduce their, to clean up their energy, that they sell, and that's going to sort of let them easily meet their compliance for any sort of RPS or clean electricity standard. Conversely, if the fee is low, then it will provide an incentive to switch to clean energy, but it may not be the main motivating factor, and people might have to go above and beyond what they might do just by the price to meet that clean electricity standard. And that's something like people predict in California now that we have a 100% clean electricity plan, is that might actually drive adoption ahead of the carbon price that we have here. They could also interact positively. For example, like a modest carbon fee could drive coal out of the energy mix more quickly than a clean electricity standard. And then the clean electricity standard would reduce, would continue and reduce the incentives to invest in new natural gas power. Or a higher carbon fee could be coupled with a late stage clean electricity standard to get at the last 10 or 20% of the emissions from the electricity sector. So if we don't think that the fee is going to be enough, you could, say, okay, starting in 2030 or out in 2035, there is going to be a clean electricity standard that will kick in at that point. Okay, and so another question is, how would a national and state CES or carbon pricing policies interact? Basically, if the national policy is more stringent, then entities would easily comply with their state policies, and that would be true on both of these. So if the federal government sets a 100% by 2035 policy and your state has a 100% by 2040, well, your state's policy at this point sort of becomes irrelevant because everyone's got to comply with the federal policy. That is, unless there are like different alternative compliance payments or different things regionally, or different utilities are covered by different things. So it sort of depends on the details, but in general, whichever one is more stringent is going to be the one that drives the change. Okay, so here's a few more talking points I want to go over. So one, we talked about earlier that a clean electricity standard is only going to affect the 27% of the US emissions that are coming from the electricity sector. By contrast, a carbon fee and dividend is economy-wide and would typically cover more than 80% of US emissions, basically anywhere where we're getting emissions from fossil fuels. Second, a carbon fee and dividend could reduce US emissions by 30% in 5 years, and whereas a 100% by 2035 CES target would move us from 36% clean electricity to 49% clean electricity in the interim year of 2025. And so that's only a 13% increase, and that's only 3.5% of total emissions. So this is where I was getting that 8 times as fast number in terms of emissions reductions. And you can see that in this next graph. This is using a model from the energy policy simulator from Energy Innovation. And you can see the yellow line on this graph is with a carbon price, and the gray line is with a clean electricity standard. And so basically models show that we can get to that, hit those 2030 targets just with a price like in the Energy Innovation Act. So the clean electricity standard doesn't end up getting you any cleaner of an electricity system until 2032 or something like that in this with this model. And you can see that the emissions go down much faster with the carbon price than they do with the clean electricity standard. Again, it depends a lot on the details of each policy, but I think in general, you'll see that a price drives emissions very quickly in the electricity sector, much faster than a straight line reduction that you might see with a clean electricity standard. Okay, a few more talking points. So a clean electricity standard is a regulation on utilities, whereas carbon fee and dividend puts a price on the fuel. And so under a clean electricity standard, the sellers of those fuels, of the coal and natural gas, would be free to look for other markets for their fuels. So that, and those could be non-emitting markets, for chemical production or something like that, but it would also be for emitting markets. So you would have this situation where, their price might drop, and so they're looking for other markets. Where else can we sell natural gas? Where else can we sell, coal? And that's like, within the domestic market. So you might see then an uptick in gas used for heating, gas used for, for vehicle usage, et cetera. And so by the carbon fee and dividend being comprehensive, being economy-wide, and being a price on the fuel, then those fuels are more expensive across the economy. Also, proponents of a clean electricity standard generally assume 100% compliance, but there's no guarantee that utility companies will comply, or they will comply, but they might use an alternative compliance payment, or they might continue to lobby regulators or Congress or otherwise fight to weaken the compliance requirements. Because of the complexities of the system, you might see over time, court cases to say you should count this or you shouldn't count that, or this is not legitimate for whatever reason. We saw that with the Clean Power Plan that never went into effect. Whereas a simple carbon fee, because it's so transparent, because it's simple, it's much less likely to be able to weaken it, especially if there's an associated dividend. And then another point is that a clean electricity standard tends to have complex rules that require an extensive bureaucracy to administer. So that invites the potential for regulated entities to manipulate that system in ways that reduce its effectiveness. So anytime you have a complex system, then there's going to be people working with those regulators to try and say, well, this shouldn't count, or we should be given more time, or I want credits for this, or whatever it is. And so like the fewer the complexities, then the easier it is going to be to set up, the easier it is to maintain the integrity of it, and the less potential for behind the scenes manipulation, and far fewer details to factor in. Okay, one more slide with some other talking points. So a clean electricity standard wouldn't have a significant source of revenue to use for a dividend. There could be some revenue from the alternative compliance payments, but not nearly the amount that would be realized under a fee on all fossil fuels. And so there wouldn't be the money to pay for a dividend or to invest in other policies. There wouldn't be a system to help make households whole. In some policies, they couple it with spending or investment to help allay some of those additional costs that you might see. That said, it's also not clear whether a clean electricity standard will actually increase electricity costs over time. There might be some bumps as new infrastructure comes online and as other infrastructure is retired early, but because of the price of renewables and other clean energy is coming down so quickly, it's very possible that in 10 or 15 years, we can shift to a primarily clean electricity grid without actually paying more per kilowatt hour or more in our electricity bills. Additionally, a clean electricity standard has the potential, So I say that it might not, but it also has the potential in the very short term to increase the cost of electricity right at the time when we need to be aggressively electrifying transport and buildings. And so if you're increasing the cost of electricity, but you're not increasing the cost of natural gas or gasoline, then you have the potential to, have people, when they're looking at, well, what kind of, heating system should I, install in my house or in this building, that they're going to still be doing the math, and they're going to look and they're going to say, well, electricity is this, expensive, and natural gas costs this, and they might continue to choose natural gas and then lock in that infrastructure. Whereas if with a carbon fee and dividend, all emitting, fuels are charged in whatever use they're in, and that sort of raises the price of those emissions across the board. And that's always going to make the clean electricity the better option, or the better and better as the price goes up and up, and as we decarbonize our electricity sector. So, so I have some concerns that a clean electricity standard, while it could eventually, if we electrify all those other sectors, help us decarbonize most of our economy, it might actually slow that process if it does, in effect, raise some of the fuel prices. And then I just want to mention there are a number of clean electricity standards that are part of bills in Congress. There's a quick list. I don't know, I'm not an expert on all of these bills. The one that I've looked at the most is the Clean Future Act, which is the sort of omnibus package that came from the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. And even of that bill, I've only looked really at the clean electricity standard part of that. But there are, in these slides, if you download the slides afterwards, there are more details on these different on the different bills that are in Congress, and then you can do some further research on your own to see the difference of what's out there.
I love it. Tony, we are so lucky to have you joining us. You can follow along and also contact Tony for any questions or follow-up. His availability is generously provided. We do recommend routing your questions to the forums, because if you have that question, chances are somebody else will too. But Tony's contact information is there too. So we'll close tonight, Tony, by just saying thank you all on behalf of everyone for all of your help. And we hope everyone found tonight's training empowering and useful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.